Hello, welcome to course 103 Rural Society and Polity, Unit 2 Rural Society, its basic social structure. Lesson 3 is on class in rural India. The lesson outlines the way in which the concept of class manifests itself in rural society. The lesson has been structured to understand what class means, to look at basic approaches to the concept of class, know the difference between caste and class, and also look at any interaction between the two. Understand that class in rural India is agrarian in nature. Know the factors that are used to classify agrarian classes, and also know about the emergence of a rural middle class. The word class is often equated with urban society, and we don't really relate its presence to a rural setting. But both caste and class are two types of stratification that we do find in rural India. While caste is rooted in a traditional social order, class is categorized based on economic parameters. In rural India, class is primarily determined by property relations, and it's mostly viewed in terms of agrarian classes. So in general terms, what is class? The use of the very term class indicates that it has an economic connotation. There are two approaches to understanding the meaning of class: the Marxist approach and the Weberian approach. According to Marxists, what defines a class is the mode of production. One class can be differentiated from another on the basis of two criteria, and these two criteria are: one, the ownership of the means of production, and second, the control of the labor power of others. So based on these two criteria, the society is divided into two classes, which are the capitalist or the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production and they can purchase the labor power of others, and second are the workers or the proletariat, who sell their own labor power. They don't own the means of production and they don't even have the capacity to purchase the labor power of others. Those who use the Marxist approach essentially view class in rural society in terms of the mode and the relations of production. The Weberian approach looks at three elements to understand class. First is wealth, that is the ability that one may have to produce or to inherit property. Second, power, the ability to exercise control over others. Third, prestige, honor and style of life. According to Max Weber, class is an aggregate of people possessing the same life chances, and by life chances we mean supply of goods, the living conditions, personal life experiences, and the chance is determined by the power that one has over goods and skills that are needed to gain income, and all this in a given economic order. So let us look at the difference between caste and class. So while in caste one's social position is ascribed and it is given, in the case of class the social position can also be achieved and there are no barriers to mobility. Caste is rooted in a traditional social order, but class arises from an economic order. Often both caste and class overlap each other, particularly in rural India, and there is a certain amount of intermingling that happens between the two. We see that richer landowners generally come from higher castes, for instance, while the Harijans have made for a significant number of landless laborers. In rural India, class is primarily determined by property relations, and it's mostly seen in agrarian as agrarian classes. But different scholars and studies have used this ownership or relationship with agricultural property to come up with classification of classes. Let us look at three types of different classification of rural classes. So First, based on a classification based on land holding. Second is a classification based on ownership and rights over land, and also the labor contribution. And thirdly is the fivefold classification, which we see more in contemporary terms. So the first one, based on land holding, on agricultural land holding, there are three groups, classes that have been identified, and this was suggested by G. Rosen in 1950s. So in this we have the large landholders, we have the small landowners, and we have farmers with very small land holdings. So the large landholders are those who owned more than 15 acres of land, and it also included a few of them who had more than 50 acres of land. This class was small in number, and they were engaged to some extent in commercial farming. And you know, if you're talking of the 50s, it would have included princely rulers, many absentee landlords also who didn't till their land, and it would have also included the dominant castes of an area. The second, the small land owners, are those who own between 5 to 15 acres of agricultural land, and they produced on this land largely for subsistence or for their own household consumption, and they did not have enough capital and resources for investing in agriculture. In many cases, they were also members of the higher castes who were a part of this category, but also they were members of lower castes who belonged to this category because they had been able to raise their economic position and could purchase land as a result. Now, farmers with very small land holdings were those who owned less than 5 acres, and this group actually also included landless groups, so landless laborers, village artisans, small traders, and members of this group generally did not have enough incentive for economic improvement. So the second kind of classification was based on ownership, rights, and labor contribution. Daniel Thorner, a Marxist sociologist, he put forward this classification, and he identified three classes: Malik, Kisan, and Mazdoor. And he looked at 2-3 different elements to arrive at this classification. First is the ownership or the rights to the land, whether they owned the property land, whether they did not own it, or whether they were tenants or they were not tenants. Then he also looked at the extent of farm work that they actually performed, whether they were absentee landlords and they only did not perform any work, or were they the actual cultivators, or were they the supervisors, or did they contribute contribute with their labor and earned wages. And also he looked at the type of income that they obtained from the land, whether it was rent, or whether it was produce from own cultivation, or whether it was wages. So using these 2-3 elements, he arrived at this classification. So first, the Malik or the proprietor. It was meant a family whose agricultural income was derived primarily from having the property right to a land, and the total amount of land that they had was adequate enough to generate income to meet the family's expenses. It's a important note that Maliks did not perform the agricultural activity themselves. They owned the land and they had the right of property. The second, the Kisan or the working peasants, they had property rights, but the size of their land holdings was adequate to only provide for a small single family. Sometimes the produce was not enough for the family's sustenance, and they would supplement from other sources of employment or agricultural labor. And in the case of Kisan or working peasant, the labor on the land, on the field, was contributed by the members of the Kisan's own family. The Mazdoor or laborers were those who gained their livelihood primarily from working on other people's lands. Even if they had tenancy or property rights, their land holdings were very, very small, and the income from agriculture was much lesser than what they earned from labor work. So the primary source of income was labor work. There have been many sociologists and anthropologists like Kathleen Gore, Yogendra Singh, A.R. Desai, Andre Bete and others who have described social class in rural India, and they've used different methodology and categories, and all these different studies throw a certain amount of light on class in rural India. But the important aspect to understand is that no reality on the ground is static or one dimensional. And to understand the dynamic aspect like class or even caste for that matter, one has to look at the specific social, historical, cultural and political context. The third type of classification is something that has been more relevant in contemporary times, a five-fold agrarian class classification. T.K. Uman lists 5 categories: the landlords, the rich or the big farmers, middle peasants, poor peasants or small and marginal farmers, and the landless. The landlords are those who own but do not cultivate the land. They employ intermediaries or they lease out the land. The rich or the big farmers do agriculture as a business. They produce for the market to earn profit, and they employ wage labor or supervise rather than cultivate themselves. The middle peasants cultivate their own land and they hire laborers only for specific operations or during specific times. The poor peasants or small and marginal farmers own small land holdings. They work as part laborers or as tenants, and the land that they themselves own is not enough for their needs. And then there are the landless who sell their labor and depend on any of the above categories for their livelihood and offer their labor services. In addition to various classes that are directly associated with agriculture, there is another group that stands outside of it, and that is of rural artisans. In rural areas, the class of artisans forms an integral part of the village community. It includes carpenters, ironsmiths, potters, weavers and others who carry out their traditional skill-based occupations. Under the British, rural artisans and craftsmen were hard hit as they could not compete with the mass manufactured goods that were produced by the industries that the British had set up. But after independence, Indian government took steps to improve their condition so that they could continue to make a living from their traditional skill-based occupations. The structure and existence of agrarian classes in rural India has witnessed a shift across different time periods. In pre-British period, the agrarian classes sold their produce to urban classes of merchants and traders. The zamindars were tax collectors and also non-cultivating owners of the land, while the tenants were the real cultivators who had no land tenure security. During the British period, some major changes came about in the economic and political policies, and these changes on the one hand led to the destruction of some of the older bases of the class formation, but on the other hand these also created the foundation for the emergence of a feudal agrarian class structure. And under the British, the agrarian system was based and followed the zamindari or the rayatwari system. A new type of landlords was created out of the earlier tax collectors, the zamindars. They introduced a permanent land settlement, wherein the ownership of the land was conferred on the zamindars. Before this permanent land settlement, land was to be auctioned on patta basis, and zamindars only had the right to collect revenue. but after this settlement, land became theirs permanently. Their only obligation was to pay fixed land revenue to the British government. In 1950s, the zamindari system was abolished. When it was abolished, the zamindars declared themselves as the owners of the land, and this also forced many of the tenants out of the land which they had earlier taken on lease, and some of them also became landless labourers. Under the Rayatwari settlement, ownership of land was vested in the peasants, who were the actual cultivators, and it gave rise to a class of peasant proprietors who climbed up the socio-economic hierarchy, and there was an increase in the number of peasant proprietors. As mentioned earlier, the British policy of trade and commerce affected Indian artisans, the rural artisan class, who could not compete with manufactured goods. The nationalist movement challenged the rural feudal class structure. Nationalist leaders led various peasant or kisan movements in several parts of India, and as a result, after independence, land reforms were introduced in many states to change the agrarian feudal class structure, and the land reforms gave ownership of land to tenants. There was also an emergence of commercial peasants, which led to increase in efficiency and productivity of agriculture, and the Green Revolution of the 70s and 80s came about. The most distinctive phenomena that occurred during this time after independence was the rise of the middle class peasantry into new landlords. At the same time, there were also few ex-landlords who lost their earlier status. Let us look at the case of Uttar Pradesh. Economists John Dres and Amartya Sen talk about two developments in Uttar Pradesh, in Uttar Pradesh's agrarian history, which became turning points. So first is the abolition of the zamindari system in 50s, which curtailed the role of intermediaries in the land revenue system, and it also made the definition of property rights in land very clear. Second was the spread of modern agricultural practices in 60s and 70s, the Green Revolution, which limited the powers of large feudal landlords. It also gave ownership rights to tenant farmers who previously did not own land. However, they suggest that these developments and turning points did not necessarily eradicate landlessness or prevent inequalities of land ownership. The land ownership structure has changed little in Uttar Pradesh since the zamindari abolition took place, and it has remained the same by and large. In the contemporary period, in contemporary times, there has emerged a large middle class, both in villages as well as cities, and they are differentiated from other classes on the basis of income, the style of life, their purchasing power of consumer products, their ability to shape economic and political decisions of the government. And this class, if we see, comprises of prosperous farmers, white collar workers, that is skilled, those who are skilled in the service sector, business people, military personnel, and so on and so forth. And they are all actively working towards leading a prosperous life, and they have ownership of cars, televisions, other consumer goods. They earn reasonably well, they have substantial savings, they invest in their children's education. So these are some of the elements that typify this group, and many of them also have ties to relatives living abroad. We come to the end of this class, and I leave you to do an activity. What are the points of 1. Clear distinction, and 2nd, intersection that you see between caste and class in rural India? Write a one-page note. Thank you.